Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio. And I'm honored to have as guest with me again this evening, author Gary Wayne. This will be the fourth segment in the series that we've been doing, and we've just caught up to where the giants are warring with Israel in the land of Canaan, and they're being led from the Exodus into the promised land. And also, we've been speaking about the flood of Noah's day and the Genesis 6 incursion. Gary, are you there?
I am, and I'm so happy to be with you again tonight, Zen.
It's my honor. Appreciate you making yourself available in this way, and also for doing this ongoing series with me. It's much better as far as a platform for covering your information. In my opinion, to be able to go at a slow pace and to not have to rush in a 2-hour program trying to cover everything, which I don't think is really possible. But and so before we start, let's give out your contact website information where people can go to follow your work and keep up with all your latest interviews.
Okay, and people, if they're wanting to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me through my website at www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6. And on there, I don't have all my videos and interviews up there, but I've got many of them up there, and I am updating all the time. There are also generous excerpts of my book on the website, so if somebody wants to get a better feel for what the book is about, you can look at that. And you can also get a hold of me on Skype, on Twitter at Gary Wayne 63, and at Facebook under Gary Wayne, and I have two Genesis 6 Conspiracy pages. And if people are looking to buy the book, you can buy it through my website if you want an autographed copy. And if you're looking to buy it elsewhere, you can buy it through Amazon, Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, Amazon.uk, Amazon around the world, BarnesandNoble.com, through most online bookstores. And even if it's not on the shelf at a Christian bookstore, you can order it from them. It's distributed by Send the Light Distribution and Ingram's, just as a regular independent store can order it as well. So the book is fairly readily available, and it's also available in Kindle form.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate you, and also Gary makes himself available to those of you that have questions. He does cover a wide scope of material in this huge compendium of work, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And so today we will pick up with where we left off in the last show. And also, everybody, the listening audience, just so you know, I had been without internet for 5 days, and so I'm a lot behind in uploading the latest interviews and the shows that I've done with both myself and with others, and so I will try to catch up very soon. But just to give you an update, and also I will be releasing my next book tomorrow as well. And so for those that have been interested in that, I'll make it available to the public tomorrow. All right. So Gary, we were talking about the Genesis 6 incursion, which is I know when I first read it in the scriptures and just reading through Genesis and coming through to Genesis 6 and reading the sons of God mating with the daughters of humanity and creating a race of giants known as the men of renown, I was taken aback, and I had to just kind of revisit those portions of the text and to really just kind of open my mind to the possibilities of what the text was actually implying, and the storyline that was behind those five particular passages. And I wanted to know more. I thought that I didn't know a lot about the subject matter, the fallen angels, and the topic that was being alluded to in that particular portion of the biblical text, but I most certainly wanted to know more. And so that was one of the things that actually began my journey into extra biblical and extra canonical texts, because of the limited amount of resources found within the canonical material, which gives greater detail as to what those passages are about. And so, can you tell us kind of what you thought when you first read and came upon those?
Well, I think I was, caught off guard as to what the heck they were talking about and why that was inserted in the narrative to just in front of the flood narrative. Because, and again, I didn't realize that it was actually part of the flood narrative until I read it, and you think, well, that's really, really strange. And then when you start digging into it, because these giants and things, they keep coming up later on in Genesis, and in the time of Abraham, and then uh, after the flood, in the time of the Exodus. So just absolute. I'm not sure. It was stunning. It was like, what the heck are these giants or these strange beings called Nephilim, depending on which translation that you're utilizing? What are they doing in Genesis, and why is there such a supernatural flavor to Genesis that we're just not taught about in church? And why does nobody ever talk about that in connection with the flood? So that sort of really got me going on the whole topic. But yeah, I would have to say just stunned the first time I realized that it actually sunk in that these just weren't larger than normal human beings.
Right, and that was also one of the questions that I asked. Was why is this not a topic that is uh, more deliberated upon? Why are they not talking about this in the mainstream churches? I mean, why is this not alluded to more in, even like with Sunday school? Of course, we know the story of David and Goliath, but that seems to be the only aspect of it that is even remotely discussed, and deliberated upon in any greater detail. But even then, it remains ambiguous and vague as far as the storyline, because really, now that I have examined the material and looked into in a more profound manner that aspect of how it ties together with the full summation of Scripture, it it's difficult to really understand the whole fullness of the story if you separate giants and the fallen angels out of the context of it.
Yeah, I think you just lose the whole meaning of what's going on and why things are going on and why things are going to happen the way they're going to happen in the end time. I think it provides the essential context to understanding, what happened in prehistory, what has happened in our history, what's going on today, and what's going to go on in the end time. And if you don't have that, you're missing such an important piece of the puzzle that um, it sort of is. I think it's almost frustrating trying to make sense of things at times because you're always reaching to rationalize. You're always reaching to fill in the gap, and you don't have to once you understand this concept. And Genesis is quite stingy, um, about the Nephilim narrative. Not that many lines, and then, as I say, these different nations of Nephilim. They continue to show up after the flood again, and so in our society that is very, very frustrating because again our churches aren't teaching about it, and nobody really knows a lot about it. More and more is coming out now as more and more people dig into it. But one of the reasons why it's a bit, I guess, stingy in Genesis, I think, just my own sort of conclusion is that it wasn't that long ago, and certainly at the time of the writing of the New Testament or the writings of the Old Testament, and certainly in antiquity, giants were just a common knowledge and understood aspect of what happened in prehistory and in ancient times, and even having giants up to the time of the Roman Empire and beyond. So when you understand that, when you read people like Josephus or other people of antiquity, historians of antiquity, giants were just a common knowledge. So how much more do you need to know about them other than that they were evil and that they were created either by gods and women, or fallen angels and women, depending on whether or not you're following polytheism or monotheism. So I think that is also something that people have to struggle with, and one of the reasons why we don't have a whole bunch of information on it. It's just that we've been brainwashed in the last say 300 to 500 years of taking these ideas out of mainstream thought and relegating any such notion to very fanciful mythology and legend and fairy tales type of things. So
Yeah, I agree. And what that was one of the things when I was kind of spurned into learning and looking into more the mythologies around the world and also the extra canonical materials in trying to find um, more detail about these giants, the fallen angels, how they were connected, how they led to even to the flood narrative. Because prior, I had no understanding as to the connections between the two. And then in looking at the histories and the mythologies and the ancient accounts, I found that there was an overwhelming amount of information about this. And so I know that you were led in similar investigation, um, thus the release of your particular book. But can you talk about that, your journey of discovery and learning about the fallen angels and the giants, and how you were then able to put together the story as it is related to the scriptures?
yeah, I think there was a couple of interesting turns that came along as I was doing the investigation, because what I was trying to do with my book was write a short book, because all I was trying to do initially was connect how the giants of Genesis 6 are related to end time prophecy, because we have um, things that are rather interesting in Revelation and in some other parts of the New Testament where it refers to the days of old and the days of Noah and the abyss and the demons and the fallen angels. And so I wanted to see, follow that sort of connection. And so it was just going to be a fun book to cut my teeth on and then get real serious on some of the other books. So it turns out there are other books that I want to write, but as it turns out, it's probably the longest book I'll ever write, because so many doors just kept opening. And the first door that was opened was that I was so stunned, surprised, set back, and it caused me to dig deeper and further afield and into more mythology and religions. And I was a mythology and history buff before. But once I understood what was going on in Genesis, and whether or not I'm reading an account of the Anunnaki or I'm reading an account out of the Popol Vuh on the Kishimaya, or whether I'm reading anything on Greek mythology or Roman mythology or fairy mythology or Norse mythology, doesn't matter where you go, all of a sudden you see the same story, and it's all connected to the flood. And it's telling different details of the same event, and it's telling it from a polytheist perspective, but I couldn't dismiss that these accounts were very, very similar. And of course, the deeper I dug, what I conclude, and I give many accounts in section 2 of my book about the global testimony, um, is that they are the same account in almost an exacting detail. What we do get is we get some more information, we get some more flavor to it, we get some more idea of what prehistory was all about and what those civilizations might have been like. And then the second thing that really turned my head, that again, if the first one I thought was surprising, this one really caught me off guard, and it really turned my book into more of a conspiracy book in sort of the modern idea of conspiracy. But when I started to look at these other mythologies and religions and their writings, they were connecting back to this initiated society. And then when I dug into the Freemasonic Society and looked at their beliefs, looked at their legends, and I'm speaking very specifically about, the Legends of the Craft by Albert Mackey, who's one of the great sort of patriarchs of modern Freemasonry, who recorded not only that book, but this is many other books. But this is a book that records their beliefs that come from an oral tradition called the Polychronicon. And the Polychronicon has a very similar history as to what's told in the Bible, but only greater. So when they use a Bible, let's say in Freemasonry, there's two different Bibles. There's the one that is the regular King James Version for the most part that they use, although there are some other translations. That's still the one most favored by them because they had so many hands in writing the King James Bible. But what they wanted to do as being part of that transition is they wanted to transition the Polychronicon and all the additional information about prehistory and history, and by utilizing this as a platform that was going to go to the other churches. And just so people don't misunderstand me, I think the King James Bible is a very, very good Bible. I'm just saying what the Freemasons utilized it for, to record their history. And their history is recorded in the craft, which I'm sure is a large piece of the Polychronicon, and even more, takes their society back to the creation at the time of the flood and before, at the time of the Nephilim and before. And their great patriarchs of Freemasonry are the descendants of Cain, including Cain and Enoch, who is credited with creating Freemasonry and mysticism and sun worship and secret societies. And these societies were created to house this information and knowledge that they were developing, which were the seven sacred sciences. And of course, the descendants of Lamech. And of course, Lamech and their descendants are the ones who created these two great pillars to ensure that their form of mysticism, that their knowledge, and the location of the knowledge was going to be saved, and the story of what happened in prehistory from their perspective was going to survive. And that was what was discovered by Hermes, and who partnered with Nimrod at Babel. So just understanding that the secret societies formed at the same time were part of this partnership of the creation of Nephilim, worked alongside with the Nephilim to corrupt the entire world, and have partnered with the descendants of the giants and with mysticism all throughout history, continue to do so today, and will do so to help bring on the end time. That just took my book in a completely different direction than what I was expecting.
Yeah, I can imagine that you are still discovering just so much information, and that if you wouldn't have decided to, basically, you have to abandon a project like that because there's just so much information that really it could have been a 2,000-page book. And that the research is still ongoing. The investigation and discoveries are daily, adding to the body of evidence, which overwhelmingly creates the story of this what we're talking about.
Yeah, I edited out 25%, and at some point I was just writing and adding more. Interesting to me, but I could have kept writing literally forever because there's just so many. You ask it one more question and you open another door, and it just leads you to a whole bunch of other different things. And I didn't spend a whole lot of time on North American Nephilim or giants because that's a whole subject in itself. I allude to them and talk a little bit about them in the book, but to me, it's just again more information. And if I was going to do a book on or do more research on that, that would be a separate book in itself because it's so massive. But if I hadn't looked at, as what you were talking about a little earlier, if I hadn't gotten out of my normal shoes and got into the shoes of the other religions and other mythologies and other cultures, I couldn't have connected these dots. And I know a lot of people might say, "Well, weren't you afraid that your faith would be lost?" And I think I read a lot of convincing stuff, but at the end of the day, um, what I was reading was not dismissing or proving wrong in my own faith and my belief. My faith actually got stronger because I could start to see some of a lot more of the holes. Although you get this really wonderful stuff up front, you get all this awful stuff underneath once you dig down deep enough, and you find out this is truly not. This is not a belief system of goodness. It is. It is a belief system of the elite. It is a belief system of the select few. It is a belief system that looks at regular humans as mundane and should be persecuted and enslaved. And it does things and leads people to do things which are totally horrible when you start to look at human beings in that way. And they look at human beings that way because they actually believe they are superior to us. They're superior to us either in genetics and bloodlines or superior to us in the cult of knowledge that they initiate themselves into. And so it's easy to have holocausts or persecution of people that they call mundane and people that they feel will never evolve into gods. But like I say, if I had not gone down that trail, I couldn't have connected the dots. And that was what was really important to me because everything that they did, everything that they're doing, and everything they plan to do runs so parallel with what it teaches us in the Bible. It's just that what they're saying is they're trying to wipe us out.
Right.
As opposed to the Bible forewarning us as to what they're going to do to try to wipe us out.
Right. Yeah, and see, that's an aspect of the story too that just sounds completely off the wall if you talk anything about the whole depopulation agenda of the elites, but yet it's the foremost principle on the Georgia Guidestones. It's number one to reduce the numbers of useless eaters or the goyim, to 500,000 to being a manageable servant class. So they're not trying to hide any of these things. And for those that have not begun to look into or investigate the conspiratorial side of the reality that we live in, it sounds completely just absolutely bizarre. And so, yes, it can be a challenge to open yourself to embracing such knowledge as possibility. Um, but when you do, then the doors start to open, and then one path leads to another and another, and so many things come to light in doing this investigation.
Well, and again, if you start connecting just some of the dots, just with some of the things that you had just mentioned with the Georgia Guidestones, is that is a pure Rosicrucian doctrine, which is one of the higher levels of secret societies and higher than Freemasonry, certainly. And within that society is significant ennobled bloodlines that are represented in that order. And so that whole concept of population control is that they would, in their ideal utopia, in their new Atlantis that Bacon would talk about, Francis Bacon, we're talking about a world that has limited population, so they could set up this new utopia. I would say dystopia, but in their belief, it'll be a utopia. But it's not a utopia for most humankind. It's only for those who they want and deem worthy that are going to be there. Those of, the gene of Isis or the sacred bloodlines that go back to the Nephilim. And so when we look at how we see another manifestation of what's going on in the world today, and we have this whole notion of overpopulation, and I do understand the population is growing. It's not clear to me that we can't support that population, but it is clear to me that this is a concept that the secret societies grab onto because it's part of their core beliefs that they only want an Earth just for their descendants. And so this overpopulation started to become popular in the late 60s and early 70s because one of the higher secret societies that would report to the Rosicrucians is an organization called the Club of Rome, and that was one of the key doctrines that they were going to start to push, along with things like peak oil. And of course, we've run out of oil, of course. For people who may not be aware, also global warming was one of their concepts that they were going to use. And these were mostly contrived ideas, and there are a few other ones, but they're determined to use these things to cattle herd people into accepting world government. And that is what the whole concept for forming the Club of Rome is that these are very special people that they think of themselves as, who can not only provide the solutions to the problems in what they believe is humanity's problems, but they're also working actively to create the problem. So they create the problem and then they provide the solution, which is part of the evilness and the direction that they're going. But that just sort of connects this whole thing back. When we were taking this right back to mysticism and to the descendants of giants and secret societies of the past, to some of the simple things that is in plain sight with us today, and how they do their policies in that Leviathan reach into politics and around the world. And of course, they specialize in policies that cross borders, that bring down nationalism.
Absolutely. Definitely part of the agenda. We'll be right back, everyone. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Couple questions from the chat room for you, Gary. And the individual asks, obviously there is a singular evil agenda to the New World Order. Has Gary seen any discord, infighting among the secret society groups?
Yeah, I think there are always internal squabbles and power plays, and even though they're all looking to do the same agenda, what they can't pull back on, no matter how enlightened that they think that they might be, is this idea of power. And power always gets sort of out of control, and people that they may be utilizing to bring about the New World Order get out of control with their narcissism. And you can look at a couple of things that they would have created. Was communism, and then communism got out of control because Stalin got involved and took it in a completely different direction than the social masonry that they had initially sort of anticipated. Then they create National Socialism with Hitler to offset communism as an example, and he gets out of control. So this is not an unusual thing. And I just use those ones as sort of greater examples as to this thing is not quite as cohesive as what people think, but they do keep moving this thing in the right direction. But because they have their own internal agendas and their own personal agendas, things do get sort of go sideways with them. And one of the families that I think is really on the outside looking in, which is fighting back, and they seem to, when they do poke their heads up, say that they're looking after the betterment of humankind against these other ennobled families. That would be the Basque bloodlines out of Europe, and for whatever reasons they were ostracized out. Now, I think if they are helping humankind, I think they probably still go back to their original nature if they were to be the only ones that were competing. So there are lots of competition out there, and there could be more bloodlines and families that I'm not aware of that have been ostracized because I'm not on the inside. But that would be one classic example of a family and a bloodline, and then I gave a couple of plays that they made that got out of control, but there are many.
Yeah, I agree. Another question, a little bit slightly different topic. Blues Girl asked, "Do you think that the Sphinx's head is possibly a mummified giant skull?" I don't even think that that's the original head, is it?
Well, the face that's on the Sphinx is not the original likeness, and so Sphinx is in kind of the same family of statues as what was going on in Mesopotamia and other areas, and so I'm trying to think of what the actual statues are, not a cherub, but oh, geez, and it was very popular in the Assyrians. But anyways, there's these winged beings and gargoyles and all these different forms that were created, I believe, are of fallen angels. And in the Egyptian mythology, and you go back to the hieroglyph and everything, the Sphinx is actually a hieroglyph of a slouching lion. And so I think if we want to go back to what the original face looked like, it was probably a depiction of Adam, Adam Ra, and that would be a depiction of Satan. So I think we're looking at either a seraphim face or but more likely a cherubim face. And so it could have been the face of a man, but it could have been a face of any one of the other three faces that go along with the cherubim, but certainly not of Nephilim. And the other thing I would go to look at is that that statue dates back in a lot of people's, or that monument dates back in a lot of people's estimation to 10,500 BC. So from an astrological alignment, it lines up with Orion according to Bouval and Hancock, if my memory serves me correct, with the way the belt is sloped to the celestial procession. That goes back to 10,500 BC. And there's also a lot of geologists who look at the water erosion and will take that somewhere between beyond 7,000 BC. So this predates standard Nephilim chronology. So unless there were other giants that were well into prehistory before the creation of Adam, and that could certainly be possible, I do not believe that would be a depiction of a Nephilim. Now, the pharaohs that were changing the sculpture of the Sphinx to look like themselves, like Khafre or some of the other ones that would have been in that area, and when they were doing that era, when they were doing the renovations on the Sphinx, they may have been trying to change the face to look like them. And so if you wanted to make a connection back to Nephilim, that the pharaohs were definitely Nephilim kings or Nephilim descendants, descendants of Nephilim who were kings, then perhaps you could look at it that way, but not the original one, that's for sure.
Yeah, I agree. The Sphinx's head seems to be a lot smaller in size than what it, as far as the proportion with the rest of the body. And then as far as the pharaohs, the hybrid, even with Tutankhamun, it shows the elongated skulls. And there's that same kind of hybridization depicted around the world, and including like in Paracas and Peru. Can you comment about that? The elongated skulls and the
Yeah, so the elongated skulls, there's several different thoughts on that. One is that was arrived at manipulation by binding the skull, and that certainly is possible. But here's some of the distinctions, though, is you can create by binding the skull something that is sort of mutated to be elongated, but what you can't do is make it bigger by binding the skull. So you'll still have the same sort of cranial volume, but when we're talking about many of these elongated skulls, there's a separation. There's the ones that would be of ancient humans who were binding their skulls, and I think after the looks of the Nephilim. And so, and they find these skulls that are of humans that are shaped in an elongated form, whether it's in Central America or in Egypt or in Scythia, in other places around the world, to emulate the Nephilim and the demigods who ruled over them. And it was a very, very popular thing with the priests to do that. But as I said, the second class is the larger ones, and you can't create larger cranial volume by binding it. So there's something that's bigger going on, and then the larger ones don't have this suture that goes back in the human skull. So it's a completely different anatomical finding, and quite a bit larger. And I think it's important to understand that if we look at these Nephilim and various hybrids of Nephilim as they descended out through the generations, that they had attributes of their ancestors, we start to understand why they had elongated skulls. And again, you can look at Akhenaten or some of Akhenaten's family, whether it's Tut or whether it's Nefertiti. They have these elongated skulls, and they have these sort of conical caps that will cover them. And there's lots of these elongated skulls. That's not stylized. That is showing even at around 1250 BC that Akhenaten was still one of the pure-blood Nephilim lines, and he still had that conical elongated skull. And that's why his dynasty, the Amarna dynasty, is so out there, is so up front with everything we see in the media and in history, because they're perpetuating this idea right in front of our eyes about these bloodlines. But if we understand that, to finish my point on that, that these were the descendants of seraphim angels who had the face of a viper, and their generations immediately after had the face of a viper. And then we understand that they had these long sloping skulls that went with it in a snake-like form, and that they continued for many, many years as part of the attributes before the bloodlines became too intermixed with humans. We understand why we have two different sets of elongated skulls. So we need to separate the humans that were mimicking it to the ones that were actually biologically sort of grown as a descendant of a giant.
Another very interesting thing as far as those kind of hybrid type beings, the real ones, not the humans that were mimicking them, is that you see that in the different cultures and civilizations of the world, that they were the priestly class, and they were the ones that were receiving message and interacting with their fathers, the fallen angel gods, and that they were established to rule over the lay people, and they were the ones that called for the sacrifices and the different things that they were involved in, that were perpetuated through the worship and the rituals, the different abominations that caused them to be judged throughout history by the Most High God.
And that's why I call those mystical societies, those mystery schools, the mystical religion, and the original ones and the ones that they're sending, I call them snake brotherhoods, because they are brotherhoods of the snake, and they do worship the fallen angels, the fallen seraphim angels, and all of the doctrines thereof. And they did mimic the ones who provided them the knowledge. When you understand that there are two different classes, let's say, of the companions of Horus, there would be the god-like companions of Horus, or the builder gods as they're known, or the senior ones, or many other names, or the Sebeti or Sebtio, and on and on and on. They initiated these priest class, and these were the snake brotherhoods that were created. And so there was the original humans that were heading the religion, and then the brotherhoods that generally went down within the family, just as in the Brahmins did, which is you couldn't even become a priest unless you were related in the family. So they had these descending lines of priests within the family that carried on these traditions, and they did that. They bound their heads in appreciation and in worship and in prostration to their gods, and the knowledge that they passed on. You know, if you look at Enki, which would be the same as Lucifer in or Satan in monotheism, Enki is, you know, his symbol in Sumerian was the snake. All of this is interconnected, and you know, I know a lot of people don't really like to think about that. There is a class of angels in the Watchers that were seraphim, and they looked like snakes, but that's exactly what happened. And so when you go back to what we were talking about, some of the stunning parts of what I learned out of Genesis 6 and what surprised me, I mean, to understand that what these brutes looked like was shocking.
Oh yeah, that was one of the most surprising aspects of, the tying together the Genesis 3, the Nakash, the story, and learning that this was actually a feathered serpent, and that connected to the mythologies of the feathered serpent worldwide. Viracocha, Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, the Chitauli, whatever name and definition these many native peoples worldwide, they had a basically a feathered winged snake or a feathered serpent. Those were the gods that they worship. And so, whether you deny it or not, or don't want to believe it, the dragon mythology is pervasive and extends worldwide.
Oh, I agree 100%. And it's just amazing, even when you dig into the Central American and South American accounts of the various gods, whether it's Veracoco or uh, Votan or all of the other gods, are all talking about, I think, the same god that brought civilization to them, and they were all snakes. And again, the stories are identical only from a vernacular perspective as what they would be from around the world. And so when you understand that civilization and knowledge, both before and after the flood, came to the people of those areas through these beings, then you understand that there's a close connection to the seven sages that helped start civilization after the flood, whether it's inclusive of Osiris or Quetzalcoatl or other names, are the seven rishis of India, that they are all talking about the same story, that there's this heavy mystical influence of survivors of the flood that are carrying knowledge provided by fallen angels, and some of them maybe even been taught directly by the fallen angels after the flood. But they would have again reestablished the priesthoods to carry on and the same religion that was going on before the flood.
Yeah, exactly. Before I forget, Gary, I wanted to ask you, you said that you had to remove 25% of your book. Can you tell us what that portion of the book was about, and are you planning on publishing it later? Will it be a separate book, a follow-up, or
I don't think so. I think it'd be a little bit too disjointed because it was coming out of basically every chapter. So when I took it to go to publish, I did that first round of cuts myself. And so in each chapter, there might be two more, rabbit holes I went down that were interesting to me but weren't necessarily essential to the story. And that's what I was trying to take out. So some really good information in some of those little rabbit holes that I went down, but they weren't essential. They weren't essential to the book. So it'd be difficult to make a story out of that.
okay, I understand. Um, The another thing that I wanted to ask you about is just recently there was L.A. Marzulli had put out a trailer on the Watcher's 10, and in it it talked about the discovery of a fairy-like being, a little being, and that they had taken DNA from samples from this little creature, that it was discovered by a 13-year-old uh, child, or I believe it was 13 years old. Maybe he said a little bit older, because they did reference this individual as driving, had to use the bathroom, pulled over to the side of the road, and discovered this little fairy body that had just recently been killed, possibly by a passing car or whatever. But in X-raying the body, they discovered that it was the full skeleton, that it was not a mold, that it had a few full humanoid features, and that it even had one portion of its leg bone that looked like it had been broken previously and had healed. And there were some other weird anomalies, where these little dots in the skeleton, that they didn't know what these things were, but they stood out in the X-rays. But do you know what I'm talking about as far as that particular story?
Yeah, I'm watching that reasonably close because I think if it's proven to be not a hoax of any sort, and I certainly have a lot of respect for Mr. Marzulli and how careful he's been on this, because I think he's been working on it for over 2 years. That and the reason why I'm watching it so closely is because it's sort of after the one of the themes and spirit of my book is about the fairy aspect, and so at this point it does look like it's I'm speculating, but and trusting in Mr. Marzulli's work, because I do very much respect this man and the work that he's done. That he's onto something, and he wouldn't be dealing with something that wasn't going to turn out to be real. So if you're wanting to know more about fairies, I mean, certainly that's one of the reasons to pick up my book and learn all about fairies, because fairies is one of those, not only an allegory, not only a belief system, but the beings are so very important to, in my research, to what happened in prehistory and what has happened throughout our history. So if you like, then I can talk a little bit more about fairies, or if there's something you wanted to go along in terms of what L.A. Marzulli has been working on, we can follow that line as well.
Yeah, no, I would like to get you to elaborate, because it reminded me of a video I saw a long time ago. I don't know if you've seen this one, but these kids are in an apple orchard in their backyard, and this I believe it's their parents were just videotaping them playing, and they go up to this particular apple tree and they look up into it, and they see this kind of weird creature, and he begins to film it, and then all of a sudden it flies away, and this creature looked just like the depiction of the fairy that L.A. Marzulli, the gentleman that I forget his name, Jaime, I believe, is the Mexican UFO researcher that had brought it to the attention of Marzulli. But anyways, it looked exactly like that. And then there were other videos that Marzulli showed in the beginning. I guess somebody had a camera set up during the night, the evening time, and it shows some of these fairy-like critters flying by and flying through this particular the viewfinder of this camera. But it's all of that is very interesting, and it would seem to be completely fantastical. And but if it weren't for the discovery of this body, the X-rays would show the skeletons, even the finger bones, and it seems to be authentic. And so, yes, if you would elaborate.
Yes. So fairy is something that I think we all grow up on fairy tales, and we don't know why fairy tales are such a living part of our childhood and what we continue to teach our children, and why it's gone on for millennia. And again, it's one of those things that holds within it the secrets and the legacy and the history in plain sight, and that's why it's kept alive by the other side. And so, going back into prehistory, and then I'll move it forward and bring it down to the size of this particular discovery, is that there were other reprobate spirits that were created by fallen angels.
Hold on, Gary. We're at the break.
Before the flood.
We'll be right back, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody, for second hour. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen, and I have as guest with me this evening author Gary Wayne. Gary, before you go into a follow-up, can you give out your website contact information and where people can go to find your books?
Yes, so Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6. And on there you can contact me through my website and I will get back to you. Or you can contact me on Facebook under Gary Wayne, or I have 2 pages of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And you can also follow me or get a hold of me on Twitter. That's at Gary Wayne 63, at Gary Wayne 63. So those are the ways that people can get a hold of me. And believe me, if you do send me a comment, I will get back to you. If you send me a video or something like that, it may take me a while to look at that, and I may or may not comment on that. But if you ask me a question or have a comment, I will get back to you on that. My book is available through Amazon around the world, barnesandnoble.com, most online bookstores, and it's available to any store, whether it's Christian or independent, if they want to order it online. It's easily available. So you can also get personalized copies or autographed copies in any way that you would want through me if you like, and you can do that through my website.
Excellent. Well, let me give you a chance to follow up on what you were speaking about. You were about to go into the fairy creatures and also speaking about the hybridization process and the different experiments which took place during the days of Noah. Also tied together
Yeah.
with the end times too, because there's supposed to be a resurgence of that same kind of thing.
So in prehistory, I mean, we know of Nephilim, and we know of fantastic beings like the centaurs and Pegasus and all these other interesting creatures that were created in prehistory. And these were part of the, whether it's Cyclops, it doesn't matter which one that you're going to go into, but these are all part of those reprobate spirits that were created either through DNA manipulation or other forms of sexual copulation. I'm leaning a little bit more towards some sort of DNA manipulation, but anything is possible depending on what they were mating with to create these other creatures. And within this realm of the fairy realm, there's 4 classifications. And so the fallen angels being the winged fairies, the opalescent fairies at the top level, and then you have the Nephilim, which were also shining beings, and you have the spirits of the original immortal ones, and then you have a group called the elementals. And the elementals were the little people. And the elementals were broken into 3 different categories. And even if you go into, like the Cherokee or other Native American lore, they'll break the little people into 3 different categories. They just use different names. So the Cherokee would use the Laurel people or the Rock people or the Dogwood people as the 3 different classifications. But generally, in fairy mythology, they're known as gnomes as one category, leprechauns as another, and little people as another one. And within these 3 categories are significant numbers of subcategories. So these are just the major ones. And so when you look at the 3 categories, just sort of quick and easy without getting into size, the gnomes were the ugly ones. And these are the ones where And I'll give an example in the book of a little gray fairy that have flying machines and kidnap people. And if you didn't know you were reading a fairy kidnapping, you would think you were reading a gray alien kidnapping, because it's the same description and the same happening, the same description of the beings. And gnomes were also connected to the mystical religions and the kingships, because this is part of the root of where noble and gnosis comes from, because these were the archivists for the seven sacred sciences, and they kept the genealogies for the priests and the snake religions that we talked about, and they guarded the sacred knowledge, and they guard it throughout history in partnership with the secret societies and the mystical religions. And again, there's many different ones, and the leprechauns are kind of the mischievous ones, and the little people are the good-looking ones. And I also want to relay back, just so that I bring a little bit more realism to it, is when we talk about the seven sacred sciences, I think in one of the shows I gave a lot of allegories, whether or not it's the pearls of wisdom, or it's the archives of the Masons, or it's the golden apples, or whichever allegory you want to take out of any particular literature. It's all referring to the same bank of knowledge. And in this case, from a fairy one, when you look at the treasure at the end of the rainbow, that comes out of fairy mythology. And the treasure at the end of the rainbow is this great knowledge. And of course, the rainbow represents the flood. So you can see the connections that are going back there. And if we go into mythology, let's say Greek mythology as a classic example that people might be more familiar with, you have some little people recorded in certain aspects of it, and in Atlantean mythology and in Greek mythology, because they're both Greek, I suppose. Like you've got nereids and nymphs, and these are part of the little people, and you've got the Fatui, which is the ones that hold the destiny of humankind, and Fatui is just a Greek word for fairy, just as phase is a Greek word for fairy in the Roman language. And so within the allegory of fairy holds something significant. I don't want to quite get into that yet because I'm going somewhere else. I'm just trying to relate the idea that there are many different types of fairies and accountings of fairies in mythology, and the more recent ones where we see these little people and gives us a glimpse of some of the different types of little people would be in the Hobbit trilogy or the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So you have a hobbit, that's one size, and then you have the elves, and there's a couple other classifications of fairies there. This is just an indication of more of those fairies. And then if you want to get, except that this one looks kind of ugly, and again, remember that when I'm talking about Marzulli one, his one looks a little bit ugly. If you get into Peter Pan, you see Tinkerbell, and this is one of the good-looking ones. So there's different sizes in each of those classifications. And Peter Pan is a terrific allegory of fairy mythology that holds a lot of interesting concepts in it. And people don't look at the fairy tales as holding this kind of information, but it's a fairly creepy story once you get into the different aspects of it. And Peter Pan contains many different types of fairies and elves and little people and children. So anything that's small, from around the world, and it's got mermaids, which is part of the whole fairy mythology. It's got young females, and she's like a nymph, which comes out of the Greek mythology. They go to a place, I'm trying to think of what they call it, Neverland, which is just another word for Anne Wynne, which is out of King Arthur mythology, which has fairies in it, of course. It's another name for the netherworld or the other world or Tartarus. So it's enclosing this different dimension and this portal that Peter Pan is going through. And Peter Pan is a little boy,
Again, a little person's when he has elf ears. So again, he's representing some kind of fairy in their history. And he has slanted eyes, and he's dressed in green, and a vine, and in leaves, which is very mystical, as in forest gods and tree gods and fertility gods. And he flies at night into this world, and he into the physical world to seduce Wendy, who is like a nymph, and he plays a flute, and I'll come back to that in part of the meaning. But I'm just trying to set the category, the whole atmosphere that Peter Pan is, as with all fairy tales, are holding a significant amount of meaning in there that people haven't looked underneath close enough. And he's also associated with Peter Pan. And just with that magic flute, Mozart, who was a Freemason, just to connect in how some of these commonalities work through the secret societies, and the arts and music is one of the seven sacred sciences, had a composition called the Magic Flute. And I'll come back to that true meaning in a second, because this is a pretty tangled web I'm trying to explain. And so Peter Pan is related to Puck and Robin Goodfellow in Midsummer Night's Dream, which has what? Fairies in it. And Puck is a sprite, which is one of the different kinds of fairies, who serves the Oberon, or Oberon, the king of the fairies. And Oberon is a Tuatha Danann name and an ancient Scythian name, whether or not you're going to take that back to Upier, which is a flying night witch, or Oberon, as in the Scythian in the Tuathan language, which is basically a name for a king because they overrule, overreign, override. It's just how you etymologically bring that forward. So understand they're bringing in these other ancient societies into it. And of course, Peter Puck, or Goodfellow, has changeling qualities, as what some people believe that fairies and Nephilim and the descendants of Nephilim actually have, who they would have received from their parents, if that part of the mythos is true or not. And so Peter Pan is just another name for Puck and Robin Goodfellow. And if it ended there, that would be one thing. But when we dig into that, we find that Puck and Robin Goodfellow is a hobgoblin. And this goes back even more into prehistory. So now let's start bringing into what the Green Man, or the Pan, or this goblin, or the Peter Puck actually was. And Peter Pan was actually one of the Peter god that he was based on is one of the gods of ancient ology that was a fertility god that flew night and was a witch, night vampire, or an Upier. So again, linking that name Oberon back. And this is the god Pan, where the name comes from. This is the half human, half goat god that everybody's familiar with, where you see these pictures on the internet. This was a devil god who played the flute. So that's why you have the flute linked in there. And flew at night, was sexually aroused to seduce and have sex with young nymphs, represented by Wendy in this case. It's a fertility god of the woodlands, and is very much connected to the allegories in Robin Hood with the Merry Men, and on and on and on with other allegories that also are going a different direction in Robin Hood. But moving on, it's a horned god and a companion of nymphs or little people. So Peter Pan, the god, is one of these gods that is very close to the obvious creation of the little people. And he had pointed ears, and he had cloven feet, and he was known in some mythologies as the son of Zeus or Dionysus. And I could probably go on a little bit more, but what I want people to understand is this whole idea of Peter Pan is not only connecting these very, very small fairies, but right back to the different classifications of fairies in prehistory. So we've got all of these different things that are going on in the fairy tale aspect. And so fairy tales are nothing more than encoded legacy, doctrine, religion, and history and genealogies of Nephilim and other created reprobate beings. Now, when we talk about fairies on the allegorical side, that mixes with the physical side, this is also the matriarchal aspect of the bloodlines of the Nephilim. This is the female bloodlines. The dragon bloodlines are the male bloodlines. And so you see a male Upier in a dragon format, which everybody would be familiar with, would be Dracula as a representation of that, right? And this also comes from other descriptions like ravens. So when you get that bird-like look when you're talking about the Central American belief system on fallen angels and seraphim angels as the bird-like ones, that's where the raven sort of look-alike comes. But you also have that classification in the Sumerian mythology as well. So when we talk about fairy allegory, we talk about the bloodlines of the Grail, and that go all the way back to Lilith, and Tiamat, and Lilith, of course, is a Upier, is a night-flying witch, is a female vampire. So these allegories all connect back and have a consistency all the way into prehistory. And so when we talk about the fairy bloodlines, this is the female bloodlines. And what happened when they started a new dynasty in their belief system is they would take a very noble bloodline of a female and marry it up with a prince. But it had to be a very, very selected female to start a new dynasty. So if that's what they wanted to do. So if you wanted to start a new dynasty in Ireland, as let's say with the Tuatha De Danann, just as a random example, then you would need somebody like a Nefertiti to go there, which they have in all sorts of different mythologies, to either reignite that bloodline or start a new dynasty over there. And of course, the Tuatha De Danann are the fairy people of the fairy mythos. And they were the Nephilim of the fairy mythos, and they were known as the elven race of the shining ones. So you have in this whole fairy belief system this thing from giant to very, very small and beings all the way in between. And then the other aspect of the allegorical part of the fairy mythos is that it is heavily wedded into the Gnostic religions and the polytheist religions, but it's the Gnostic religions where you see the most defined aspect that are most visible that connects them to the fairy belief system. And so in that, this is the matriarchal succession of the bloodline, and they call it the elven bloodline, and the elven bloodline of the Tuatha De Danann, just as the Tuatha De Danann are known and call themselves the elven bloodline. And when we look at the elven bloodline of the Gnostic religion, this goes back into history and was a huge part of the Albicinian crusade to wipe them out, and the sister Gnostic religions that were there, because they believed that the elven bloodline in this religion holds the fate of the Grail bloodlines and is a Grail bloodline. So not only do they believe that the elven bloodline goes back to Nephilim, but it holds the Messianic bloodline of the dragon and the shining ones of the elven race of the fairies, and which they believe goes back to the Tuatha De Danann, which they believe were equal to the ancient Egyptians and other equally ennobled Nephilim original kingships of prehistory. So all of this is connected through literature, entertainment, religion, and actual history. And so I just wanted to give sort of a quick overview as to how many different sort of areas where we can look at where the fairy allegory goes. But the particular one that connects into King Arthur that I referred to earlier is the fairy bloodline of the Grail Queen, and that's the matriarchal womb that goes back to Lilith. And all of this history, all of this literature, whether it's Shakespeare or Ovidius or Plutarch or Walt Disney, they're all telling the same story.
Wow,
And it's
that's fascinating.
unbelievable when you think about that.
Yeah, I don't think that a lot of people have really heard about or studied that in especially in as great a detail as you have. So, can you just tell us kind of the how far back it goes in your study? What are some of the original or the origins for this particular story, the Peter Pan epic, and all of that?
Well, Peter Pan's more of a more recent um, uh, story, but what it does do is it wraps in more information that's collected from around the world. But fairy tales, they go right back to the time of Jesus and further back. I mean, they're with us all the way back in. If you go into the German or the Norse ones, it really goes back into prehistory. These stories have been with us all the way through. So, and they have different flavors to it. So, like in the Lord of the Rings tradition, you see more of the Norse Germanic flavor being overlaid, which is, I think, one of the reasons why that one has been so popular, because it sort of brought that sort of context or vernacular flavor to it from that area. But whether it's uh, Grimm or Santa Claus, or all of this is built on stories that have been told in older nations and older cultures. They're just being sort of added to. But certainly there was a renaissance of the fairy tale aspect that started with the Templars, who are also connected in here because they're the ones who were protecting the elven bloodline secrets. But that's a little different direction. And they sponsored the writings of the Holy Grail and the King Arthur ones, and the fairy aspect that came with it. And within those allegories, you have the more recent ones. And those fairy tales, again, whether or not it's Cinderella or Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, they're really talking, as they're encoding in two specific things. And Robin Hood would be another one. And Robin Hood was banned from so many countries when it was first written. But they're encoding how in their allegories, let's look at, let's say, Robin Hood, because this one's a little easier to do. You've got Robin Hood, who's this prince-like character, and then you have Maid Marian, and they're separated. So the first thing that they're doing is they're encoding into this an allegory of Mary Magdalene and Jesus as a more recent overlay on the ancient sort of fairy tale concept of their bloodline. And again, I don't believe that Jesus didn't die on the cross. I believe he did, and he was raised to heaven. They believe he was taken down from the cross alive and met up with Mary Magdalene later, and they had 3 children, and Josephus, the third one, is the one that is the bloodline that they're following here. And they're having to live apart, which they do in all Grail and Holy Grail mythologies, that go back to Joseph of Arimathea, who is a descendant of the people of the kings, whether it's King Arthur or Gawain or whoever else you have that are further down in the time of King Arthur, because he marries into those families. But back to Robin Hood. So you have the bloodline and you have the separation that's encoded in there. And so the sheriff and King John are the allegory of the Roman Catholic Church persecuting the Gnostic religions, which they did. And so you see the sort of good and bad aspect of these fairy tales. Those are the sort of the modern overlay into it. But within the characters of Robin Hood, whether it's Mary Maid, that goes back to or Maid Marian goes back to Mary Maid, which is a mermaid, and goes back to Morgan Le Fay, which is in King Arthur, and goes back to the nymphs and everything of Atlantis. So they're encoding other names, and they also believe that Marian, they use that as a derivative of Miriam and Mary, and again, all for important allegorical religious reasons that are from polytheism that they're using and they're mixing in there. And of course, Robin Hood, who's dressed in green again, has the same allegory as Peter Pan does. So now you see some of the more ancient allegories being woven in there, and then all the different individuals of the merry men are representatives of key important people throughout history in their religion, and even the name Merry Men goes back to Mary's men, the people that were protecting Mary Magdalene and her bloodline. So it's so many different things that are going on there. So understand that there's an ancient fairy mythology, and then there's the more modern writings and more information that they're bringing in to sort of bring things up to speed.
All right, we'll be right back for final segment, everyone. Welcome back, everybody, for final segment. I wanted to ask you, Gary, about the Homo florensis, and if you know about that, the discovery of many hobbit skeletons on this particular Indonesian island, and that there have been other such discoveries found elsewhere of these very small people that it's frustrating for all the evolutionists because, like the giants, it doesn't fit into their the whole Darwinian scheme that they're trying to perpetuate and propagate. And so, but anyways, can you talk about this? Because like in the Colburn Bible, there's a lot of discussion in the mythology surrounding those particular texts of these different kinds of beings, these different kind of hominid beings, dwarves and elves and fairies and gnomes and the whole spectrum of Lord of the Rings type characters, which seem to be just fantastical, and yet the reality is they most certainly were part of the whole of presence here of being on the earth.
Yeah, and let me touch on a little bit on the little people, because I think there's a lot more going on there. But just let me link that back to that thing on the Lord of the Rings that you just talked about, because I missed it before the break as you were asking me to take it a little bit back into prehistory. And so, Lilith, held the matrilinear inheritance of Malkuth, which comes from Tiamat, which is another version of Leviathan, and she also held the rings of kingship, or the ring lords, which were the Anunnaki, which is the whole sort of allegory for the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings, that's where this comes from, and that's the fairy aspect of it. So you ask how far it goes back. It goes back to that level. And Lilith is the sort of the original allegory for a screech owl. And when I said you have dragons and ravens, and you have fairies and owls on the other side, so that when you hear of the Bohemian owl that goes on in the Grove in California for the meetings, that should get people a little bit concerned as well. But the original spelling for the screech owl in Hebrew is Lilit, Lilit. And a screech owl hops on one foot like a goat. So you start to connect in all of these other different allegories. And Lilith, as I had mentioned earlier, was a night demon, night flying witch. And in witch, that is a popular word for vampire. And the Latin word for vampire is strix, meaning screech owl. So again, we start connecting all of this. And vampires were night witches, or Upiers, which goes back to Oberon. And how far does Oberon, King of the Fairies, and Midsummer Night's Dream go back, and the various other derivatives and usages for the name Oberon? Well, Oberon comes out of a Teutonic order, which is the order that in mythology goes back to the Aryans in the German side, which is why the Nazis used the SS in the Teutonic order, but to the Aryan Ubar, and was also Scythian, and then Sarmatian for Uper, which stands for overlord. And these were all Nephilim kings that this goes back to. So all of these different connections go all the way back. And so when we talk about Lord of the Rings and these other different fantastic beings of little people, and then we talk about what you're talking about was the discovery of these small skeletons in Southeast Asia. One of the commonalities that people don't understand with the flood narrative and the Nephilim narrative is that in all continents around the world, my research has found that they also have connected to the flood and connected to the giants, the little people. And little people in North American tribal legends, it's absolutely crazy how many different accounts of it. And I run on one of my Genesis 6 pages accounts as people send them in of findings of little people's bones, just like findings of the giant bones that have been recorded in newspapers and other documents, and then they go back to the Smithsonian and they just disappear again. And so nobody can convince me that there aren't organizations out there making these discoveries disappear, because when you've got newspaper articles recording them, describing them, some showing pictures, some showing drawings, and they all go back to the same sources, obviously there's a few organizations out there that are trying to suppress this information. But understand that this is one of those common world heritages, and why the fairy belief resonates throughout the world. It, again, is unaccounted for, and in this case, the fairy belief is in the little people.
Yeah, it is interesting how the Smithsonian just makes so much of these skeletons and these anomalous type beings just disappear, which is why I would hope that people would wake up to not sending any of this evidence to them any longer. They certainly don't have credibility, which or reputation for preserving and sharing such information with people. And so, most certainly, because these kind of things are still being discovered, which makes me I want to ask you a question about, do you think that the recent wars, the war on terror, and afterwards, the events of 9/11, our invasion, the United States invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, which, of course, when you look into the deeper aspects of 9/11, those countries were not responsible for the attacks of those days, but do you think that the elites wanted to go into those particular territories and areas to gain access to some of these archaeological sites, to Babylon in specific, to the tomb of Gilgamesh, which was only recently discovered and was still being excavated at the time of the Iraq invasion? There was all of those gold artifacts found in Afghanistan that looked like, little airplanes. I mean, so much um, archaeological evidence in those two countries, that there was anything esoteric to the nature of those particular wars.
Yeah, I think they were brought on for a number of reasons, and whether or not we want to think that these factions, whether it's Al Qaeda or ISIS or who they're funded by, certainly there's a good case to be made that if you want to create world government, you have to create enough anarchy that you'll run into the open arms of the globalists who have all of the answers and are the same ones who created the problem. So, I mean, there's an MO there. And then underneath all of that is you've got some of these countries that they've been trying to sort of turn over and change the regime over is they're trying to make sure that they have a reserve bank that's in all the countries of the world, and so you can follow a lot of that from countries that didn't have a occult history, portals, um, access, knowledge, information, whatever they're looking for is also a significant part because there's a whole bunch of black ops that are going on in those countries searching for things like that. And again, hard to get solid information on that because they're black ops, but
Right.
there's a whole bunch of black ops that aren't just designed to kill terrorists that are going on in those countries.
Right, exactly. Like I don't know if you read the story of NASA's involvement even in with the 33 miners that were caught underground, that whole other side of it. But if you haven't heard of that part of it,
No,
the
I haven't.
it's fascinating. I'll send that to you after this show. But
Okay.
certainly there's an esoteric aspect that is not spoken of. But supposedly the story was is that they broke into a chamber where they had discovered a lot of gold, but then they also opened, and sort of like what Phil Schneider describes when they were building these deep underground bases, and then they built over an already existing structure, and then when they um, breached a certain portion of this particular deep underground base, they kind of invaded into a territory that was occupied by some of these reptilian dragon-like entities, and so uh, there was, you know, a lot of black ops that were lost, or special forces that were lost, Delta forces that were lost in trying to save Phil Schneider and some of his other people, but it was the same kind of story, and so I'll share that with you. And the next time we do show, we can comment on that further. It's interesting, but
Sure.
it kind of
Wow.
falls in line with the discovery of the and the mythology, the Native American mythology of the Lizard City, or
Yes.
the under Los Angeles, which
Yep.
again, you know, sounds crazy, but this is the historical record.
Or the and it is a historical record, and also the tunnels that they say are in Mexico that goes to these great underground cities and chambers and things. And there's been a little bit more of that in the news. There's something that is really, I think, hidden and not looked into a lot because it's so difficult of what is going on underground and how far back in history does that go. And I think in one of the shows on the Saturday night you were referring to a reference in Ezekiel about the people who dwell underground.
Right.
And I'm trying to remember, right? And that's in that where it talks about either Satan or the Antichrist. Yeah, so if that happened before, is there something that has moved forward to today where our governments are gaining access to those underground cities or tunnels or chambers or whatever they might be? And one of the things that we learn is even they don't really let much of this out. It doesn't matter whether it's in Malta or Tubelbeki or I think I pronounced that one wrong, but the one in Turkey.
Yeah, Göbekli
Any of
Tepe.
these, yeah, that's the one. They have it's there's as much and more that's interesting that they don't talk about that is underground than is what they show us above ground. So there was a strong subterranean culture that goes back to almost all of the ancient civilizations, and more it's a bigger architectural work than what we've seen above the ground. It's absolutely astonishing.
Right. Even in the Emerald Tablets, it talks about some of these um, underground structures being put into place. You know, and these are thousands and thousands of years ago, and like Phil Schneider had described, they were some of the deep underground bases. They were being built upon already existing structures. And then my friend Jonathan Gray based out of New Zealand, he sends out reports all the time of the discovery of different kind of underground passages and connections to, there's now so many megalithic sites being discovered all across the world that have established within them these underground tunnel structures and and things like that that have not been looked into so much more than I think that even has been discovered because there's 30 something pyramids that have not even been excavated in China alone that have recently been discovered. And there's so many megalithic sites now with all these high altitude aerial photographs which are being uh, they you can see an underlining artificiality that is not natural to these structures, and so a lot of that is happening across the world as well.
Well, and they won't even endeavor to look underneath or dig underneath the pyramids. And again, there's so much um, mythological history, if I can use that sort of term, to the underground vaults under the pyramids, right? The archives of the Masons, the subterranean nine vaults of Enoch, and more are described in history as being buried underneath the pyramid. So again, these huge, monstrous subterranean structures, and the labyrinth out of Greek mythology was underground as well. If you can imagine a tunnel system of that size and scope underground, so there's such a strong mythos on that I think there just has to be more to it. I mean, I don't have a lot of information that I can put out as hard on that, but every bone in my body suggests that there's a lot more to this than what we're being told.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much still yet to be discovered, and that is coming to light. And that because we are the fig tree generation and that we're at the end of days, um, the Spirit is being poured out on all flesh, and all that which had been hidden is now being brought to light. Which is why I think a lot of the revelations of individuals like yourself and myself, that we're being inspired by the Spirit to bring forth these truths so that people can then understand the gospel in a way that they had never even considered prior. And that, those that are truly seeking answers, which they're not getting from their different pastors, preachers, or church authorities, that like especially with the Ancient Aliens series now, and the whole perspective that the ancient aliens are our creators, all of that being pushed forth, reminds me of that miniseries recently, Childhood's End. Have you heard about that?
I've heard about that, but I've not seen it.
Okay, well, I haven't seen much of it myself, but I did see the season finale, and it's basically this individual Corellian. He's part of the what are the overseers, which are a group of aliens that sort of like Independence Day. They come and take up position over all the cities of the world, and then rather than attacking humanity and trying to destroy it, they are supposedly here to help us bring in the golden age, to help humanity to end the wars, cure disease, heal the
Yep.
sick, that kind of thing. The same thing as
Yep.
what the Bible describes as, the Antichrist being performing all of these miracles. And so, if you would, can you comment on that? And we've got like 5 minutes, Gary.
Okay, and is that the same one that when the commander dies out, they take his essence and put it into another body as well? Is that the same show, or
I'm
am
not
I
sure. I'm
confusing what
not.
people have talked to me about?
Yeah, I'm not positive
Okay,
because I'm not very familiar with it. I only saw that
yeah.
that final
Well,
season ender. But go ahead.
what whether or not it's to hit the concept that you were talking about, whether or not it is Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, or it is the alien offering of what they promise, or it's the apparitions of Mary coming out of the Mary cult. They're all offering a similar sort of gift, if I can put it that way. And that gift is, a new golden age, a new area where science and religion works together, but it's a polytheist religion. An age where there won't be any wars, where knowledge will flourish and people's enlightenment will flourish, and people can evolve into godhood. But if you don't accept this, then you'll destroy yourselves from the face of the earth. And they all talk about the same offering and the same curse and imposing that Nimrod did back in Babel. This is why Babylon of the end time is related to Nimrod at Babel, because they were trying to, again, become like gods. They were trying to protect themselves or lest they be destroyed from the face of the earth. They were developing this great knowledge, and they were rebelling against the God of the universe that was trying to keep them enslaved in the physical world and not evolve into gods, and to be enslaved just to worship them. And so if we see an alien or any of this type of apparition or something that is offering this Babel syndrome, we know that that is the Babylon that is coming for the end time, because they all talk the same religion and the same gifts and the same cult of knowledge and the same path or way, as they would call it, the way of Hermes, the way of Tao, the way of Cain, to godhood. And it is the same doctrines, just presented in a different format.
Oh, sorry about that. I had it on mute, but we have been warned about that, and I definitely believe that what we are going to see, because a lot of people, when they study the New World Order, they think that the whole agenda is to establish world government. But Pike, in his vision of escalating these three global wars in order to establish a one world order, was so that they could establish the basis for introducing to the world their god, the Masonic sun god, the Luciferian doctrine. And so that's the real ulterior motive behind all of what they are trying to do in establishing this global domination, this world order, that they want to hand it over to the Antichrist. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, they know that, and it's been tried in the past. I mean, you can't likely dominate the world through war. It just takes too long and is too destructive. But if you can set up a system and a platform to establish world government, then you have the ability to implement that belief system and impose it on the people, just as it was done by the Nephilim and just as it was done by Nimrod. And then they can introduce as well with that platform their dragon messiah, their false messiah, and that's, of course, not everybody's going to go for it or fall for it, but that's why there are two different holocausts that are going on in the end time.
Right.
Persecutions or holocausts, however you want to look at it.
And there are a lot of people that are primed to accept the ancient aliens as our creators, or that they're jumping the gun on evolution is the reason why we're not able to find that evolutionary missing link.
Yes, and I think the alien perspective is a significant part of the delusion of the end time, and I look at it as also a significant part of our rapid development of our sciences and our knowledges in preparation for the end time. And even some of the language would suggest that there's going to be this alien delusion, even with the Antichrist raising his throne, into the heavens, and that Michael's going to fight, and the angels are going to come down. So you've got this conglomeration of this alien fairy deception that is designed to fool humans to rebel against God in the end time.
Yes. Thank you, Gary, for joining us again. Uh, God bless all.